Welcome to this discussion panel entitled China, Science and the World. The panel and the session was put together jointly by the World Economic Forum and Nature magazine. My name is Magdalena Skipper. I'm editor-in-chief of Nature. For those of you who are not familiar with Nature, it is a weekly science journal and magazine which publishes both original research and science-related journalistic content. Before going any further, I'll just remind you that this session is open for reporting, and also if you're interested in following the session on social media, you can do so by following hashtag AMNC19. So I think you will all be aware of the fact that over the past 10 to 15 years, we have seen a steady and increasingly more rapid, one could say meteoric rise of China on the world scientific stage. In 2016, China surpassed the US as the world's largest producer of scientific articles. According to Nature Index, which tracks the affiliations of high-quality scientific articles, China has seen 75% rise in research output since 2012. This is perhaps not surprising, since scientific research is central to President Xi Jinping's dream of China becoming an innovation-driven, knowledge-led economy by 2050. China's funding for science and research is set to reach 2.5% of GDP in 2019. That's a report I read actually just this morning in South China Morning Post. And just to give you a perspective, China spent 1.9 trillion yuan, that's about 290 billion US dollars, on research and development, or 2.18% of its GDP. And that's an 11.6% increase from 2017. And these are statistics from National Bureau of Statistics here. And for comparison, in the same period, the US went from spending 2.6% of GDP on research and development to 2.7%. And to give you another perspective, in 2017, for example, Israel and South Korea spent 4.5% of their GDP. Now, we know that China's research capacity is growing, but more recently, China has turned outside of its borders to begin to influence the science and science landscape on a global scale. In May this year, Nature published a 5-part series of articles based on in-depth reporting on science and research aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there have been many sessions on this particular initiative here already, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the initiative and its appraisal, widely discussed. But of course, most of the discussions focus on the economic and trade perspective. Here, and indeed in Pages of Nature, we focused on science and science capacity building, which form a very important part of this ambitious project. As a reminder, some 130 countries have signed cooperation agreements with China. So to discuss this vast topic of China's collaboration in science and science research, I am privileged to have a very distinguished and diverse panel with me here today. So over to my left, we have Minister Sarah bint Yousif Al-Amiri. She is Minister of State for Advanced Science in the United Arab Emirates. Next to her is Assistant Professor Ying Liu, a life scientist working at Peking University. Next again is mathematician Dr. Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, who's current president of European Research Council, a major research funding body in Europe. Further to the left still, we have Dr. Zhijian, electrical engineer by training, but now president of Chinese Academy of Science and Technology for Development. And last in line, but certainly not least, we have Melinda Richter, who is Global Head of Johnson & Johnson Innovation. So let me ask the first question to the whole panel, actually. And that is, from your perspective, which is very particular and complementary to everyone else on the panel, how do you see such a possibility or opportunities from this impressive, possibly unprecedented effort that China has initiated? What benefits do you see within your country or within your region? And I will actually, to frame this discussion, I will actually ask Professor Hu to start by addressing the question.
谢谢。
Well, thank you for the question. I think this is a very good question because since the 18th National Congress of CPC, President Xi Jinping put forward the strategy of innovation-driven development for China. Innovation will be the top leading driving force for China's future growth. This is a very important shift to try to transform the model of economic growth of the country. Also, he has proposed that we will seize the opportunity brought about by the Industrial Revolution 4.0 by tapping into a larger talent pool to transform China's economy. And we are seeing very evident progress in recent years, especially in the field of entrepreneurship and innovation. We are gathering very strong momentum. So it's fair to say that Industrial Revolution 4.0 is unfolding across China because China's traditional industry focused on the lower end of the value chain. There is a very strong demand for new technology and innovation to upgrade their position in the value chain. So it's highly relevant for China to embrace this round of industrial revolution. It also is well aligned with our national strategy. The impact will be comprehensive, not only for its economy, but also with the implementation of technology to have a better social development and governance structure. So it's a very profound revolution, and we are still at the beginning.
Thank you. Perhaps next I can ask Professor Bourguignon to comment from a European perspective. What do you see, how do you see that ambition for China to collaborate on such a scale with other parts of the world? And of course, although mainly the focus has been on other Asian countries and parts of Africa, those collaborations have extended well into Europe.
Well, first of all, of course, it's a major event for the reason of the size of the investment. And also, I've been visiting China for a number of years. My first visit was 1979, so in a rather different country. And for sure, it's not just a question of volume, it's also a question of quality. And we see in the next generation of Chinese scientists, and some of them have been trained abroad, but more and more are trained actually in the country, that they are really trained at the highest possible level. So of course, the appearance of a new competitor is also something of importance. And actually science altogether, research in particular, is a domain where we are always in the context of competition and collaboration, because no scientist can ignore what the other ones are doing, and at the same time we still want to do something different. So this is always this situation. So I think for every country or group of countries like Europe, the only possible attitude is of course to organize yourself, to give the best possible chance at the level of European Research Council. In particular, we challenge the young researchers to give them a total freedom to develop their research completely at the initiative, in the bottom-up approach, but at the same time to also develop relations, cooperations with other countries. And this is why for China, we have an agreement with the Chinese National Science Foundation, NSFC, for the possibility for Chinese scientists to visit some teams of the European Research Council. But at the same time, we are also completely open to the world, which means that the people who can get grants from us don't have to be all the time in Europe. They have to be at least half the time in Europe. So because we feel that being open is the right way of developing the science at the highest level.
Thank you. Perhaps it would be interesting to hear your perspective now from the perspective of the UAE. How do you see those possibilities? Of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative more broadly, not just in the terms of science, UAE signed an agreement with China, I think in April, earlier this year. But here, focusing specifically on science and research, what do you see as the most interesting opportunities, but actually potential things that maybe are of concern to UAE as well?
So collaboration has always been an underlying factor for development of scientific research in the UAE. More than 60% of our research is internationally collaborated. And we understand the value of different perspectives and diverse backgrounds to push the boundaries of scientific discovery further down the line. And collaboration across the board, be it in Asia, in China, with Europe, and with the Americas, is very important for us to push the boundaries when it comes to the challenges that we're facing and finding solutions for those. Our perspective when it comes to the development and the need for science and technology is very similar to China's. What we're currently focusing on is the evolution into a know-how based economy, one that's driven by innovation, one that's driven by taking the outcomes of a lot of the research that has been happening and creating economic value and finding solutions to the challenges that we're facing, one from our arid environment when it comes to food, one when it comes to water, when it comes to better healthcare that is more targeted towards our region, and a better understanding on outcomes of our region. And this is where collaboration across the board plays a huge role in advancing those findings. And we, as an overall global science community, need to work hand in hand to find the right solutions when it comes to those challenges for each region, so that a lot of the perspectives that come and outcomes of research are not targeted to one region per se. They are more diverse in outcomes. They are more diverse in terms of implications and perspectives, and that allows us to find solutions from a global perspective without having that disparity that we're trying to completely avoid, and ensuring that people have equal access to the outcomes of research and are able to implement it within the context of their regions and are able to push the boundaries of science from the context of their regions.
So that's a very important point, I think, that diversity of perspectives that comes from collaborations from individuals, researchers from right across the world. So if I can just follow up on that with a question. So of course, collaboration in science is not new. It's the very lifeblood of science and research itself. But I guess what we're talking about here is an emergence of a very important collaborator and enabler. Would you or anyone else care to comment how perhaps the future direction and shape of science may alter as a result of that new player on this stage, research stage appearing, how it might play out now?
So science hasn't been owned by any one entity. At the end of the day, it is the byproduct of humanity's curiosity. And ensuring that multiple players can come into this playing field, can have an equal footing, can have people develop, and that's the primary focus that I think all the countries are having, have the necessary people that are able to be in that field so that we're able to collaborate is imperative to the overall research perspective and the overall science ecosystem when you talk about it globally.
And I also think science has shifted from single investigators, little science, to the multinational, expensive, interdisciplinary, big science. So I think this move could foster international collaboration to solve global challenges, and I think it's a big move. I would consider to compare that with a Human Genome Project, which takes 13 years and 6 countries' effort to finish that project. So I think, this move would support international collaboration, and eventually it will benefit everyone.
I have to say your comparison to the Human Genome Project is particularly close to my heart because I'm originally trained as a geneticist. So thank you. This was completely unprompted, but I am also a great admirer of that project and indeed how it showed the way for international scientific community to collaborate and not only just collaborate, but collaborate openly for the common human good. Absolutely. So one question I wanted to ask, so one of the focuses of China's investment as in the context of science as part of the Belt and Road Initiative is particularly focused on training as well as creating infrastructure. So in terms of infrastructure, it's a matter of building institutes, both in China, but also in other countries that collaborate with China. And just if you think about training of young scientists, something that actually has become less of a priority in the rest of the world, think about these numbers. So since 1995, the number of international students in China has grown 12-fold, from 36,000 to about 442,000. And more than half of these students are from other Asian nations. And Professor Bourguignon made this comment saying that so many of Chinese researchers used to train abroad, and many of them came back to China. But of course, now we're seeing a sort of reshaping of that dynamic, and so many of other potential researchers come to China to be trained, and perhaps will go back. So my question is about training of the future generations, and it really is to anybody on the panel, but perhaps it would be interesting to hear a perspective from Professor Hu in particular. So given the training, or the scale of this training opportunity, how can we make the most of this opportunity to ensure that the strategies for the future of quality of research endeavor and research integrity are maintained? Professor Hu, perhaps you can start and then the others can join.
Indeed, China is investing very heavily on R&D and scientific education. By 2050, as you have mentioned, China wants to build the country into a know-how-based and knowledge-based economy, and science will play a pivotal part in this process. That's why we will see a growing investment in science and research. And there are a lot of catch-up to do in China in terms of scientific research. With regard to the development model, we want to maintain an open approach to engage very actively into international cooperation instead of relying on our own. And our future scientific research plans and also the foundations will also be open to the world, especially countries involved in BRI. And you have mentioned that currently scientific training is not the first priority of BRI. Infrastructure is still the area we focus the most. But I want to point out that President Xi Jinping has clearly stated 2 years ago that BRI should be an initiative of innovation. And this year, he also said that the initiative will be a digital initiative. So apart from roads and bridges and other infrastructures, China endeavors to help all the BRI countries to seize on the opportunities of technology revolution, which will benefit all of us, especially the developing countries, because they can help them overtake their counterparts and also achieve faster growth, including green technology, will also be very important to reduce the environmental footprint. At the Ministry of Science and Technology, we have an initiative which comprises 3 parts, including collaboration for laboratory construction.
And because this is needed of our country and also of the country along the Belt and Road Initiative, so we can jointly create laboratories in those countries. And secondly, that we can cooperate to establish science and technology parks, because in that parks we can translate the technologies and the research into industrial production. And also, the universities and the research institute can be opened to those countries. For example, we can offer some opportunities to join our scientific programs or some subsidies and so on. And of course, we will have different initiatives in terms of overseas education. So the Belt and Road Initiative would be started from the infrastructures. For example, road, railways, and bridges, they are the essential part. And gradually, build on that, we will grow more and more. And I think that is a broad sense, because the scientific research is also a kind of infrastructure. It will give us more opportunities of innovation, and therefore we believe laboratories would be another kind of infrastructure. This is something we're doing step by step. Because if you don't have roads and bridges, of course, those laboratories is not possible. But I'm not saying that you should do road and bridges first, and then you do laboratories. I'm just saying that we should do those things in parallel with different functions and different departments. And also, I think we should open to European countries and other developed countries. From 2020 initiative, we have been participating a lot. For example, from the institution where I came from, we're also engaged in some 2020 programs. So how do Chinese scientists can join in those programs, contribute to the sustainability, to climate change, to the environmental protections, and so on? These are the problems faced for all human beings, and we should emphasize on the cooperation. And speaking of the green development, China hasn't got enough knowledge pool. So we do need to involve other countries' scientists to join in our footstep to make China greener, and also to help China contribute more for the 2030 United Nations initiative. Because China is still a developing country, and we hope to be an example of green development for other developing countries. But we don't have enough knowledge, we don't have enough know-how, and therefore we need the help of other countries. So we are open, and we think this openness can contribute to science development.
Melinda.
So what's important about science and technology is the impact that we're trying to have. And it's hard to have that impact. So, for example, when we think about our health, all around the world, we have a surging increase of chronic diseases, whether it's diabetes, obesity, infectious diseases, cancer, mental health. And these are really big problems that impact every local government, both in terms of its citizens. When you get sick, you feel it. If you haven't been a patient, or if you're not a patient today, you will be in the future. And when it happens to you, it's a very vulnerable place to be. And when you get sick, that's when you realize how hard it is to get the therapy you need. Because when you investigate it, you realize this kind of infrastructure to create solutions for health is so expensive. And very few governments can actually afford to invest in it, let alone small companies. And so the only way you can harness the power of local innovators all over the world who can solve these big health problems for their local communities, be heroes in their own hometown, is if we invest in infrastructure, in laboratories, so they can get started, if we can invest in science so they can come up with these new technologies that can save lives, enhance lives, or we need to invest in the commercialization so we can translate that science to the patients. And let's face it, if you don't know this stat, you should know this stat. It takes at least 8 to 12 years to get a drug to market. and billions of dollars. So the only way that these local entrepreneurs, these innovators can have a shot at making a difference for their communities and also for people around the world is if we come together and invest. And this collaboration between public and private parties is critical to making that happen. We just partnered with the Shanghai municipal government and the Pudong New Area government to create a JLabs there. A JLabs is a place where people can come first for educational programs, networking events, funding series to build skills and capabilities and confidence that they can get their innovation started, and then we give them labs. Together we've created this platform where you can go and get access to millions of dollars of equipment that most companies would have to go out and raise funds for so they can start a proof of concept, get access to wet labs and offices and dry labs. They get access to experts who can help them either, come up with the right work plan, figure out what the right unmet need is, or get funding, get regulatory advice. So this collaboration that we're doing with the China government here in China so that local entrepreneurs can solve local problems, but also people from all over the world can come here. One of our companies, Holmos, is coming here. We have so many companies coming here to solve these problems. So this investment to save lives, enhance lives, is so critical to every region around the world.
So can I just follow up on what you just touched on? It was actually going to be my maybe not the next, but another question, but since you brought it up, it's a perfect cue for that. So we talk about international collaboration and international investments, and you so convincingly articulate why it's needed, and of course it's difficult to argue with that. But you also talk about commercialization of science, and we know that we talk about science, we also talk about it, or the fruits of discovery and research, as a national asset. Often that's the language we hear. So how are these issues resolved in the case of commercially important strategic international collaborations, both, for example, from your perspective, from JLabs, but also from a perspective, for example, of China investing in science infrastructure in other countries?
So how does the commercialization happen? Or?
How do you resolve essentially who benefits directly from these joint investments?
Well, the people win, right? I mean, you commercialize technologies that many times wouldn't even get to see the light of day, and again, it's hard to do these things. So our JLabs is an open innovation approach. It's no strings attached. All the companies that come in there and work there, they don't have to give anything to J&J. No first rights, no equity, nothing. We just want to see them flourish because it is so hard to work in this space. And then as we get to know each other, maybe we'll partner together, but they could partner with anybody else. Our companies across our global network, the 540 companies, have done over $11.6 billion worth of financing and strategic partnerships, and many of them are not with J&J. And that's what I loved when I heard the keynote this morning, this concept of open innovation. That's what we need, certainly in very big intractable problems, especially in health. We need to work differently. And listen, if it's not a problem for you as a patient or really as a government to create economic development in their local communities, it certainly is a big budget item, right? So you think about the impact, creating these collaborations and giving it away so that these companies, the best, can rise to the top. Because listen, even with all of that, it's still hard for companies to be successful, to get their solutions to the people who need them. So you have to be open to creating this change, and hopefully along the way people will want to work with you, and people want to come to China, and we see that. We had our grand opening last week in Shanghai. We had 31 companies as a part of our grand opening. That's the most number of companies of any JLabs in the world, and we had at least one company come from each region from around the world to be here because of the opportunity to be a part of something that can service so many people here.
Minister, you wanted to make a comment.
So what we're looking at the moment is creating value for science, for the community, and for society. And that's how you translate a lot of the outcomes and the imperative that's happening when it comes to research that's happening for discovery, for curiosity's sake, is at the end of the day, it's meant to impact our daily lives. At the end of the day, it's supposed to create value in our societies, in our communities, for our economies, and drive the overall development across different fields forward. And something that we need to talk about, and you mentioned the aspect of training scientists. We also need to train society as a whole to become innovators, because those that translate outcomes of research into implementation are not necessarily scientists. They're not necessarily people in the applied sciences field. They could be people from diverse backgrounds, from the arts, from the social sciences, that go about translating a lot of the outcomes of research and creating actual products and services that get to people's daily lives. And that training is necessary to change the overall perception of society, to allow experimentation to be ingrained into the way that we do business, to allow for failure to happen, to allow for discovery in the realm of businesses to happen, and to provide the necessary ecosystem for that to flourish. Something like JLabs is actually quite conducive for that to happen across societies. But we need to not forget that science does not only occur in labs at universities or academic institutions or at specific research institutions. Science could also happen, technology can also happen outside those realms, and together with people that are not necessarily from that background. And it's the skills of curiosity, the skills of an appetite of taking on risk, and the ability to fail and recover from failure and continuously move forward is very important when we're talking about creating value from this knowledge that has been acquired and accumulated across the board.
Thank you.
第四次工业革命，我觉得最大的一个特点就是。
Well, for the fourth industrialization, I believe the most important part is that it brings us opportunities for everyone. Because previously, we need to have a certain educational degree to participate in the innovation. However, with the fourth industrialization, it enables everyone. For example, in China, we have some innovators from the rural areas who hasn't received university education, maybe only high school education, but still they can do their innovation. The key here is that we should build proper infrastructures to connect everybody, so that people in the remote areas, they would get connected to the global network to find their proper position to create value. And I believe that those basic things, those infrastructures, will be the enabler of everybody. And it will close the gap between the rich and the poor. It will reduce inequalities and so on. So infrastructure, especially the digital infrastructure, has an essential role to play. We're not saying that a country should be extremely advanced in terms of technology. I think every country and everybody can join in this process.
Very important points here. I think especially attractive is this idea of society as innovators, and that sort of egalitarian approach, right? Your example of individuals with no formal training, no formal background, those who we never could imagine previously in this role of innovators, now opening up, having that opportunity. I think these are very important points and very new, right, in the sort of framework that we're creating. You want to make a comment?
Yeah, so as a scientist, I really want to emphasize that science has no border or no boundary. So, well, I was shocked when NIH ordered top university or institute in the United States to investigate Chinese researchers which are based in the US and funded by NIH, and which may lead to the shutdown and closing of many labs. So I think humanity will benefit a lot from international collaboration, and I think that's what we should do. So just don't be short-sighted and keep our mind open.
Thank you. Professor Bourguignon, so traditionally Europe has had more closer ties, stronger collaborations with North America. Now there are opportunities to collaborate elsewhere. Do you see particular opportunities, particular advantages from that increased diversity of collaborations?
Well, maybe the first comment I should say that when I was a young scientist some time ago, actually quite often Europeans would meet in the US, not in Europe. So I think the first step was Europe to realize that it could be a powerhouse for science. And definitely the European Union has contributed to that a lot. And in particular, the framework program for support of research innovation has done that. Now, as soon as you realize that you can be a global player, of course, you have to look to think globally, which means that you look everywhere where there are possibilities of collaboration, which add value to your own, production. But at the same time, I think if you become a powerhouse, then, of course, people want also to visit you. This was the first flow, and personally I benefited from that, of Chinese students coming to Europe. And of course, this was the starting point because, particularly in the Chinese context, the relation between a student and a teacher is extremely strong. So in a sense, this really creates a very special bonds. Of course, many Chinese went also to the United States. So I think the situation in terms of what you say about the new setting, the fact that China, because of its investment, because of its long-term commitment to developing research, as it was said, 2050 is the border in a sense, is the horizon which is proposed, which is a very ambitious horizon. So of course, I mean, at the level of European Union, it's very important that people realize that if they are serious about really developing science in Europe at the right level, they have to look not only to the West, but also to the East. And in particular, China is a typical example, but other countries in Asia also have been investing a lot and transforming themselves. And because they invest a lot in science and technology. You gave the example of South Korea. South Korea is a country which didn't have really a great tradition of fundamental science. It had a tradition of engineering, but not so much. Now they're making big efforts in this direction. Of course, South Korea is a much smaller country than China, but just in size. But for sure, for the European Union, it's very important to, if you want to be a global player, to look at the world as is proposed by this roundtable as a place where you have to look around and consider all possible collaborations which can add to what you do, in particular partly because you're challenged. And challenge is always part of the game if we're talking about science.
And just can I add that, listen, when you're dealing with science and technology that's very long-term, takes a long time to get there, and it takes a lot of money. There's very few players in the world that are willing to have that long view and to invest like that with that amount of risk in it. So whoever does invest in it, you have to applaud them for doing that. When you come back to what the impact is for humanity, and you're willing to put that out there to do it, it's an incredible contribution to the world.
Absolutely. So I have many more questions, but I'm going to hold back to allow you to ask questions of the panel. So are there any questions from the floor? There's a question at the front here. Right here. I think you have to raise your hand a bit further. Right in the second row here, there's a question here.
A question to the panel here, especially the presidents of science institutions. You've mentioned several times that universities are in fact sitting on treasure troves of data. Yeah, so this is data stocks or knowledge stocks which we are sitting on. And in terms of digitalization, especially in the Chinese digitalization initiative, how do you propose to turn these stocks of knowledge into flows of knowledge? I mean, I think nature is trying to lead by good example by suggesting, in fact, open data repositories. I mean, now is in fact the time to really set good standards and good practices and maybe bring these into effect. So in fact, how would China like to address this issue, or in fact, JLabs for that matter?
I can talk about what we're doing. So, you know, at Johnson & Johnson, we believe the best science and technology should become the best solutions for patients and consumers all over the world. And if we believe that to be true, which we do, we also have to be humble enough to say that that best science and technology is just as likely, if not more, to come from outside the walls of a big company as inside. But when it's out there, especially when you're small or an academic institution or a startup, you face so many hurdles to actually translating that science into an application for people. And so our job is to locally embed ourselves in ecosystems around the world, kind of like what China is doing, and to enable and empower that local community to translate into commercial applications. And so we do that through these soft skills, educational programs, and networks that we put together. It's the other thing, you know, people ask me what's special about Silicon Valley and can entrepreneurship only happen in Silicon Valley? It can happen anywhere as long as you can get connected to the right experts, and that's what we try to do across the globe. And then you need access to this infrastructure, and then you need access to funding. And so that's what we try to do. We're in 13, we're opening up our 13th location next year. We just opened up in Shanghai, and we have 540 companies, and we connect them to each other, we connect them to experts, we connect them to funders, we connect them to government partners, and then we invest in those plays where it makes sense for those companies and for us. And it is dramatically increasing the velocity and the volume of opportunities for health and wellness solutions around the world. And you know, for us, that's a major investment in communities that we don't have any ownership in. It's an investment in the industry. So that's what we're doing for that.
So I guess this is also an opportunity for me to make a comment, which was actually part of a question that I had, but I'll make a comment and let's see if anybody on the panel bites. So the comment is indeed that global collaboration through the scientific infrastructure, through the scientific exchange and training of the next generation of scientists is an opportunity to come to a global agreement about what we do with data, what we do with research ethics, what we do with science-related policies. And this is a tremendous opportunity. I think in the past, we've tried to do it in the research community, I think in sort of smaller pockets. But now, as those collaborations become truly global and they extend to parts of the world which previously maybe didn't have a seat at the table, it becomes a new opportunity, an important one that I think should not be dismissed. I don't know if anybody would care to comment, or even from the audience, the panel.
Yeah, I think part of the discussion on this issue is, of course, the issue of open access to publications and open access to data. Open access to publication in the case of the European Union is quite clear today, because if you are funded by the European Union, you have the obligation of making your publication open. But publication open data is a slightly more complicated issue, because in a sense, if you want the data to be usable to people, you must put them in a format which your community agree upon as being a format which makes them reusable. So in a sense, if there is not some kind of preliminary work which is done at the community level, that there is a definite format which for that kind of data will be relevant and usable, I don't think there will be a solution for data which will be the same for all things. So it shows that, again, for this question of data, organization of the scientific communities will be very, very important if you really want to make sense of that. And of course, on that issue, of course, data representing today something of great value. You can imagine also that privately generated data, maybe people will not be so much willing to share. Mm-hmm. But at least for the part of the research which is publicly funded, you can request this. But this cannot be just an abstract request. Yes. It has to be a request which has to be embedded, recognized, and really by the scientific communities, which really have to shape them in a way which make them really usable.
Mm-hmm. An example of that is what we have for planetary data in the space sector. You can access data from any mission, European mission, US-based missions that goes to any planet. outside the realm of space. And our mission, the Emirates Mars mission, has also wanted to contribute to that. And there has been a community that has come together. There's a planetary data system that has that data available. There's a particular format that you can store this data in, and the science community is aware of how to extract that data and how to utilize it and how to benefit from it. And there's a very interesting way of how it's managed, where the nodes for various areas when it comes to planetary science is distributed across institutions, and institutions manage those databases. It has been very valuable for us as a new country that has entered into planetary exploration to learn by utilizing data from other missions that are going to be similar to the data that we're going to capture from our missions, and having it accessible and having it open to the public has been imperative to our development efforts and imperative to the development of the researchers and scientists that would then go on and utilize our science data. And it has been imperative to the education process for students who are at universities who want to be involved in the mission. And it was very easy for the team to point them to data sets and point them to data sets that are similar to the mission, that they were then able to extract from it their thesis projects so that they can continue their education down that realm and be able to then support the mission and utilize data that's coming out of this mission and move that forward. So there is good cases. It's one case that I am aware of, and I'm sure there are cases across different communities. And I think it's the role of community to come and step up and say that we have this data that we've captured, and other institutions, other places, other countries may not have access to these instrumentations and may not have access to this form of data. And that's the only reason that they're not doing that kind of research. And it's very important for us to start addressing it across different scientific communities on how to do it. And I think we get down to the private sector that you mentioned. And you hear a lot that the data is the fuel of the future. But at the end of the day, it's a raw material. It's like stone, it's like metals, it's like oil. If you don't know what to do with it, if you don't know how to extract it, if not the right amount of people are able to find ways of creating value out of it, it's still going to remain a raw material. It's not going to have any value sitting anywhere. So I think that proposition, some companies are realizing it, and that's why they embed themselves within the community, like you've explained with Johnson & Johnson's. Others don't, but I think we have an imperative as an overall community to start discussing this more broadly and to start better understanding what is the real value of data and what you should hold on to just to have your survival as an organization and your development as an organization, and what you can give to the community, because what you need to do is also survive within an ecosystem in each of your sectors.
I think it's also when as you go around the world, you realize everywhere you go, there you are. You have the same issues, and that the world gets a lot smaller, and we're dealing with the same issues, and therefore we should have maybe some global standards around data, especially when you're talking about health data, and privacy, and consent, and there's a lot of fear out there about AI and how that's being used, and yet there's real value to it. And so if we could have some international standards that just keeps everybody feeling safe about how that data is used, then I think we will do a real service to the industry, and again, back to the people who deserve us to be standard bearers on that.
Right, there's a real opportunity there.
I think there are two types of data. One is data generated from public financed research projects. At the European Research Council, last year they proposed the concept of open science. Since then, China reacted very actively to this proposal. We strongly advocate the concept of open science. Especially as a developing country, there is a strong demand and desire for the developed countries to open science cooperation. But of course, there is the question of international standards. How shall we open data? Under what framework? I think in this area, we still need a cooperation and discussion at a larger scale on a broader basis, because this is essentially a matter of rights and interests. Another type of data is data generated from by consumers under the Industrial Revolution 4.0 and also the data sharing from public sector. So for this type of data, I think we shall keep developing our framework as the world develops, because a lot of the businesses are still emerging, and it is not very suitable for us to set some predetermined rules or standards. For example, in China, we started a pilot program in Guizhou in big data. We tried to entrust some public data to private sectors so that the private sectors will help manage traffic and some other public services. But one challenge is that if one single private company takes over the responsibilities of the government, then this private entity essentially will function as a government. So I think there are lots of problems we need to resolve as we develop and to develop more rules and regulations. But there are some bottom lines and principles we need to follow. For example, the safety of human beings and also to defend against threats of AI. So
It's about the distinction and the balance between openness and privacy. We have time for more questions. Are there more questions from the audience? There's a question at the back there.
So China already has a great research university, but then funding is one side of the problem, but also attracting talents can be another challenge. So what's the sort of your ambition to bring more talents to this mainland China to build more strong research, capacity? That's one question. And the other one is also heavily, driven by international standard, but also I think China can also do something to set some regulatory standard or potentially also try to gatekeeper of some of the major publication for the research community. So if you have any ambition you can share about it, that'll be great.
I will start with the second question. I'm not sure about the relation between regulation and the talent, but of course, to invest in scientific research, we will need a lot more talent. And I think the philosophy and concept is also evolving. In the past, we focused on attracting more Chinese students so that more students would come back to China. And this is out of the considerations of their language proficiency and also the familiarity with the Chinese culture. So, but this also creates some tension with the U.S. because a lot of the Chinese talents are coming back to China after completing their education in the U.S. So today, we are trying to attract talents by investing in research infrastructure and also by engaging in large and advanced scientific research projects, including lunar probe projects. And these projects will be open to the international scientific community. International scientists can come to China to work on the projects, or Chinese academies and universities. So China is trying to diversify the source of talents, shifting from focusing on attracting overseas Chinese students to open to the whole international community. And we will adopt a merit-based approach when determining responsibilities and compensation. For the regulatory question, in China, we are also trying to bolster and strengthen scientific research integrity. We have experienced some scandals in Chinese scientific community. There are some plagiarism in the scientific publications, but we adopt a zero-tolerance attitude. And for scientific ethics, we have been following the footstep of the developed world. But China is now entering into some uncharted waters because we are pushing back the boundary of the research. We are entering some unknown research areas. So research ethics becomes a new challenge. There is no previous example to follow. So we need to be extremely careful to manage scientific ethics to comply with the international consensus. So I hope I answered your question.
Very quick question. We may have time for one quick question before we need to wrap up. There's a person over there.
My question is to the whole panel. How do you see the fundamental contradiction between science as something that is purely public and technology as something that is, by definition, private, and especially part of technology is being commercialized, adding the fact that the global system continues to be based on the concept of nation states? How do you solve those fundamental contradictions?
So much for a quick question. We could have a whole panel discussion on this topic, but I am going to challenge the panel to answer in one sentence only, please.
我觉得这个科学
Science knows no boundary. Magazines, journals like Nature is open to all. But the key is that for developing countries, we need to boost our own fundamental scientific research so that we can benefit from the public knowledge. So as we develop our economy, China feels that there is the obligation for us to invest more in fundamental research to make more publications because we benefited a lot from public publications.
One sentence contribution. Anybody else on the panel wishes to take that?
So this is not an issue that has come up today. It's not an issue of today, that science and translating into something that has value and commercial value. This is exactly what has been happening for centuries. You discover something, you don't know what it's for. Eventually, it evolves throughout the number of years as your understanding of it evolves into something that is of commercial value. And I don't think it's something that diminishes the value of science as a public good. It's something that adheres to the full pipeline of development of transforming this knowledge into something that's implementable and into something that is impacting people's lives.
So it's been an amazing discussion. I think we could spend a whole day and possibly the whole meeting here discussing these topics, and new aspects of this would emerge. I think from all the various perspectives that we heard here and the different aspects that were highlighted by the questions, we can see that undeniably science is a global endeavor. When you think about global nature of science, you have to think about diversity of approaches and solutions that emerge from this. And of course, the most important thing, that the questions that science tries to address, the solutions that it finds, are global questions and global solutions. So it's only right that collaborations are global. One of the really beautiful things that has emerged from a number of statements here is, of course, we cannot think about science in isolation from society, and some of the recent developments, and indeed that global inclusion of researchers has brought science much closer to the society globally. The new avenues for collaboration right across the globe bring opportunities for us to think about new policies relating to science, policies and regulations that emerge from the scientific community themselves. We talked quite a lot about data, for example, about ethics. We touched on that. Ethics of scientific behavior, but also scientific publishing. These are incredibly important issues. So with this, I would like to thank my panel, who've been tremendous, and thank all of you for your presence here and for your fabulous questions. Thank you very much.